So here's what I have a few starting points. I initially called them principles, but maybe they're not principles. And then I want to talk about two sets of challenges with ultra-rare disease treatments. One is methodological challenges, and the other one is policy challenges. So next slide, please. Okay, so I think the first thing to say is that ultra-rare does not have an official definition like we have definitions for rarity in the context of orphan drug legislation. But typically, to be ultra rare, we're thinking that the condition would have a prevalence of less than 1 in 50,000 individuals. And that's a lot rarer than the official definitions of rare disease. For example, in the European Union, it's 1 in 5,000 or 5 in 10,000, I think, 25 in 50,000 individuals. So if you think of Brazil with a population of about 215 million or so, you're thinking of about ultra rare means 4,500 patients in the whole country, where rarity generally, orphan drug legislation, would mean something like 120,000 patients in the population. So we're talking about very, very few people suffering from these diseases. And but there are two other points here. One is that these ultra rare disease treatments compete with other treatments for healthcare resources. So in principle, they should be subject to the same level of scrutiny when we evaluate them. Now, that may not be possible in practice, but I think as a matter of principle, we should be trying to look for the same level of scrutiny. And then also, the basic methods of economic should apply to all health interventions within pharmaceuticals or beyond pharmaceuticals. There may be some different challenges in different types of technologies, but generally speaking, the same method should apply. And if you want to deviate from the standard approach, you may need to justify that and be transparent about it. And I'll come back to that later, because in the case of all ultra-rare diseases, as Mark has indicated, some jurisdictions do deviate a little bit from their normal criteria for evaluating products. So next slide, please. So there are a number of methodological challenges. I want to focus on 4, and they're mostly to do with shortfalls in the clinical data. So we find often for these conditions we have poorly controlled or single-arm clinical trials. There's often a use of surrogate outcomes rather than final outcomes that have direct relevance to the patient. There's a relative lack of understanding of the disease epidemiology for these conditions because not many patients to study. You can't so easily see patterns in the development of the disease. And there's a lack of validated quality of life measures for these conditions. So let me go through these one by one. So if we go to the next slide, let's talk about poorly controlled or single-arm clinical trials. Next slide, please. Okay, so it's argued that randomized controlled trials may be difficult to conduct in ultra-rare diseases, partly because there's not many patients to randomize into 2 groups within a given jurisdiction. Also, maybe there's a little bit more concern about life-threatening conditions and lack of willingness for people to want to go in a trial and be randomized to the placebo or usual care group. The pivotal clinical evidence that's being submitted to regulatory bodies is increasingly based on single-arm trials. And I think once the regulatory bodies has accepted a single-arm trial, it's a little bit difficult for the HTA body to ask for more. But there probably should be a bit more pushback on this, because there are a number of cases I can think of where, for a given disease, one company has said it's impossible to do a clinical trial because there's not enough patients. And you find for the same condition, another company has done randomized controlled trials. So I don't think it's something to be accepted without question, but I think we are seeing a lot less evidence being submitted to the regulatory bodies for these types of conditions. So if RCTs are unlikely to be feasible, or at least we're not going to have them, we need to think about methods for analysing single-arm trials. And there's a very interesting paper published by the European Medicines Association Authority that identified 15 potential types of bias in single-arm trials. I put the reference there. And so what it means is we need to give a lot more consideration to how we select external information for the comparison, whether that's a historical control or a real-world data set, and the statistical methods used to adjust for confounders in these cases. And there is quite a lot of literature emerging on some of those points. So people do turn to a measurement of surrogate within the trial, which a surrogate is an outcome that you think is a reliable indicator of the final outcome. And in principle, that's not a problem. There are lots of examples where surrogates would be a very good predictor of the final outcome. But what we usually insist on in HTA is that if a surrogate is used, it's validated in some way. So if you go to the next slide, you can see the three ways potentially a surrogate could be validated. Level 1 being the best, level 3 being the least adequate. So this was from a paper by UNETA, which is a voluntary collaboration between HTA agencies in the European Union, and they produced a lot of methodological materials. So what we really want is level 1, where we've had randomized controlled trials where both the surrogate and the final outcome have been measured, and we're able to look at the correlation between the two. Now, that may not be easily possible. So level 2 is probably the more interesting level for these purposes, where we would try to see whether there's a consistent association between the surrogate and final patient outcome in epidemiological or observational studies. Level 3 we wouldn't be interested in. So there's a discussion going on in the European Union at the moment about the HTA of drugs for rare diseases. And I think one of the crunch points is whether they're willing to accept level 2 evidence for validation of surrogates. And some countries are not too happy with that, most notably Germany. But we'll see what they finally agree. Next slide, please. So we could validate then with rare diseases, but it's probably going to be level 2, the observational data. And there have been some examples of that. Probably the most well-documented one is NICE in England was looking at drugs for chronic myelogenous leukemia, and did accept evidence based on observational data to validate a surrogate. And there's an interesting paper there by Ciani et al., which talks about what happened in that case. So we'll see what happens with these rare disease treatments going forward. So another problem we have, particularly with ultra-rare diseases, is that since there's very few patients, there are relatively few case series or epidemiological studies. Sometimes these diseases have been only defined relatively recently. And so even in the case of observational data, we may not have very good data for use as external controls or as possible validations of surrogates. Also, if you're an economist and want to construct a decision analytic model, a typical kind of model would have patients transitioning from one health state to another over time. And often we get the information for construction of those models from previous studies, either the control arm of the clinical trial or a long-term observational study. So even though we could potentially validate surrogates using observational data, and if we could have external control arms of trials using observational data, we may not have much of that data in the case of ultra-rare diseases. So the final one, which I'm not so sure this is as serious, is the shortcomings in the quality of life measurement for rare disease treatments. And it's very difficult to develop health state utility measures for these, or patient-reported outcome measures, because the small numbers of patients to make any form of research more difficult. It's argued often the patient population is very heterogeneous, and there's a relatively little knowledge about the disease and its progression. So some research on this was undertaken as part of a European Union project I was involved with, and this explored the problems of using or obtaining health state utility values and patient-reported outcome measures in health technology assessments for these conditions. So next slide, please. And one thing that we did look at was 24 assessments that had been done by NICE on orphan treatments, some of which were ultra-orphan, but not all. And about half of them came through the standard NICE program, and the other half came through the health specialized treatments program, which Mark mentioned earlier. And you can see that in only 4 cases out of 24 were the EQ5D data gathered alongside clinical trials, and other types of methods were used, trying to, for example, map through from disease-specific quality of life data through to the EQ5D, or using vignettes where you would have a description of the patient's health state, and then people would assess whether what health state in EQ5D would that correspond to. And very few cases were the committee very happy with what we'd managed to achieve on quality of life. Although it seems to me that if you're using general values or generic values like those provided for EQ5D, you're not necessarily much worse off in the case of rare diseases than you are in general, with the exception probably that there's going to be less EQ5D data gathered alongside clinical trials in rare diseases, whereas you may have that opportunity for non-rare diseases. But it's certainly something that's been mentioned in the literature as a challenge for trying to do economic evaluation in rare diseases. Next slide, please. Oh, okay, one more. Yeah, so how would you deal with the clinical uncertainties? And this came up in the questions to Mark. So one way people have looked at this is to have a managed entry scheme where conditional reimbursement of the technology would be made until additional data were collected while the product was on the market. And typically, in England at least, this has been within 2 to 3 years in general. And the idea is that if we collect a little bit more data or even allow for more maturity in the existing randomized controlled trial data, we may be able to make a better assessment of the real outcomes for the new technology. And we've had a couple of programs going, one for cancer drugs and one for other drugs, innovative medicines. But as Mark said, actually, although it's possible to have some kind of data collection for ultra-rare diseases, and indeed, I think most ultra-rare diseases, there would be some kind of registry established for patients suffering from that disease for all kinds of reasons. There hasn't been used very often by NICE in making its decisions, or at least the ministry in deciding on the price. And I was talking to somebody at NICE about this last week because of another project, and he was telling me that in Scotland there has been some of this outcome data collection to help finalise the reimbursement decision on ultra-rare diseases. But in the case of NICE, most of those products have gone through with a price reduction. So the ministry in England was much happier just to negotiate a price reduction and approve the treatments on that basis. So what about the policy changes? Well, this was alluded to before. A lot of these ultra-rare disease treatments are for serious conditions. A lot of them are for conditions affecting children. So it does seem to cause a disproportionate amount of political debate, particularly if the decision is to restrict access to treatments. And I guess there are good reasons for that, but it's certainly something that I think, as Mark suggested, has affected policy quite a bit. Just recently, the UK turned down the new drugs for Alzheimer's disease that had a little bit more efficacy in delaying progression. And you'd expect there to be a huge political debate, given all the elderly people like myself around, but not much at all. Whereas some of the decisions on ultra-rare diseases affecting very few people have actually caused quite a lot of political debate. The other thing, as has been said already, if you evaluate these treatments by the standard method, they're almost never cost effective, even if you had large price cuts. So I don't think any of these drugs in European countries have got onto the market without a price cut. The question is what the level of that price reduction is, and these are kept confidential, but price cuts in the 30 to 50% range are not unusual for these treatments. Now, even if you were a ministry and were able to get a 50% price reduction on the standard price, it still wouldn't be cost effective. I think you'd need to get something like a 90% price reduction for some of these drugs to make them cost effective by the standard criteria. The other thing that's a policy challenge is that a lot of the recent drugs for ultra-rare diseases have been cell or gene therapies, where it could be one injection, with the cost of that injection, and then the potential benefits may be in the long term, which of course is uncertain. And that could be a challenge, just although there are very few patients, as Mark indicated, if you've got to pay a large upfront cost for one of these treatments, that still could be a substantial budgetary concern in the short term. So lots of things have been explored in the context of these policy challenges, and let me go on to that. Next slide, please. So two things. One is use of what we call supplemental processes on top of the standard HTA approach, and also the use of innovative payment and pricing schemes. I want to say a bit about both of those. So the supplemental processes, there have been a number of jurisdictions where these processes have been applied for ultra-rare diseases. You can see a reference there. I think in that paper we looked at about 40 jurisdictions, and around just under a half of them had some kind of supplemental process for rare diseases. And these can be different things. They could be different evidential standards, typically more relaxed standards for the clinical data, a different committee structure and pathway, or a different decision rule or threshold. So Mark had mentioned the highly specialized treatments program in NICE, which would be an example of a supplemental process. So that has a different committee from the standard appraisal committee, and it has a different decision rule or threshold. In principle, it doesn't have different evidential standards, but we know that the submissions to that committee are generally, the clinical evidence is generally not as well developed as it would be for a standard technology. So are they a good idea? Well, I think as Mark hinted, many health economists and health services researchers think these processes are not adequately justified. It's very rare for a jurisdiction to bring in one of these processes and then say in detail why they think it should be justified in that circumstance. And I don't think I've ever seen a detailed commentary on why NICE had its highly specialized treatments program. And so I think the presumption is it's kind of a political fix, which may work well, may not. I think that these programs are often viewed as a reward for providing inadequate evidence. And I think I've been in a number of discussions at NICE where people have said, well, look, we shouldn't reward this manufacturer for not trying harder to produce some decent evidence on their product. I guess one advantage from a policymaker's viewpoint is that if you have a supplementary process for orphan drugs, it may take away arguments from the main HTA process. I can see some kind of attraction in that from a policymaker's perspective, because if you have a general process which is quite successful and usually produces a reasonable HTA judgment on most treatments, you don't want the reputation of that policy being undermined by the arguments about some difficult cases. And that happened in the Netherlands at one point. But I think what NICE has done, I think, with the highly specialized treatments program is kind of put the arguments, had all the arguments outside its main HTA process. But that doesn't mean there aren't arguments, as Mark suggested. But it's kind of putting it to the side of the main process. The other thing I suppose is worth saying is that in all jurisdictions, these are very restricted in their use, and 1 in 50,000 is a typical entry point for one of these programs, but in some jurisdictions it's 1 in 100,000 prevalence that would limit their application. So if there is a supplemental program, it's used in a very selective way in many countries. And just on the innovative payment and pricing schemes, so you can have these outcome based, like the Cancer Drugs Fund in England, or they could be financial, like staging of payments or working out an annuity or subscription that would be paid for access to the therapy. And there's a plethora of these schemes. And if you want to look at more information, there's as part of another EU project, there's a thing been established called the Pay for Innovation Observatory, which has got identifies 59 different kind of archetypes of these schemes and then gives examples. There's currently more than 200 examples, but that's been increased at the moment. And so you can use these payment schemes to deal with uncertainties by linking payments to achievement of outcomes or the duration of effective therapy, or you can use them to produce staging payments in the context of gene therapies. But as Mark suggested, there's plenty of ideas for kinds of schemes you might use, but they tend to be quite restricted because either there's complexities in setting them up and monitoring that it's been implemented properly, or there are budgetary rules, particularly for moving payment commitments through time. A lot of ministry budgets are not allowed to do that because of what the Ministry of Finance has laid down in terms of its rules. So these schemes are kind of a really good idea, but often more difficult in practice than they seem in theory. This particular project I'm talking about here is trying to get to the bottom of some of these difficulties and to try to put some practical solutions on the table so that we can use more of these schemes in the future. Yeah, so in conclusion, there are lots of methodological challenges which mainly relate to shortcomings in the clinical data. I don't see that problem improving unless the regulatory bodies get a little bit tougher in what they require. There have been a few methodological and financial approaches to reduce uncertainties in the clinical benefit, and decision makers just like straightforward price cuts. Ultra-rare disease treatments are almost never cost effective when judged by the standard criteria. So if you're going to treat them differently, which we're not saying you shouldn't, you need to be fairly transparent about that and just define or being very explicit about the reasons why you would treat some treatments differently from others. But it's not a lost cause. I think there's a lot of things that could be tried or have been tried around the world. Okay, I'll finish at that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for the great presentation. And thank you for sharing all those data and thoughts. We already have some great questions from the audience. I would like to start with a question that we already started to discuss in the last session. And you talked about the point about the innovative payment and price schemes, the patient access schemes. So the question is about your opinion about that tool to solve the uncertainty, mostly the long-term uncertainty about the new cure therapies like gene therapies and something like that. And
yeah,
link it to.
I think one thing. I think to make these payment schemes succeed, we need to have simple processes. So one thing with these conditions is very small number of patients. So in principle, there's less patients to follow. And secondly, it's quite common for these patients to have a continuous care in a particular clinical centre, where their outcome is monitored fairly carefully. So I think one could use the existing monitoring systems to look at what the outcome is. And you could construct a payment scheme that kind of the payment was received. So I think there are ways that it can be done. One of the things in Europe would be, is there possibility for more countries working together, given there's small numbers of patients? And the thing to bear in mind in Brazil is that probably you wouldn't be one of the first countries where that drug was launched. I mean, you might be, but my guess is that there'll be previous experience with that particular drug in North America and in Europe, and you perhaps could benefit from some of the data that may have been collected in performance-based schemes in other jurisdictions. So, for example, at the moment, Germany is putting a lot of these treatments into some kind of registry that they'll monitor outcome over time. So, I fully acknowledge all the difficulties people have raised about these schemes, but other than just going for a very large price reduction and taking the uncertainty, I'm not quite sure what the solution would be other than some kind of innovative scheme.
Mike, what about the negative consequences when the thing goes wrong? Like we don't have too much experience in risk sharing agreements in Brazil, but we have a lot of experience about price discount. And yesterday we were talking about a particular case where the manufacturers offered a particular price to be reimbursed, and we have decided to reimburse this technology. But today they are charging the health facilities with a much higher price, and don't have too much to do. We can review the decision, but this investment here is something very hard to communicate with society. So do you have some examples or opinion about when the consequences are not that we were expecting?
Obviously I can't comment on the Brazilian situation, but my understanding that a lot of these agreements in Europe are contractual. So within the form of the contract, the company has to keep to its promise. Now there are some drugs, not orphan drugs, where prices are able to be raised, and there's been some consequences recently about President Trump's activities trying to get favored nation status in the US and the extent to which there'll be ripple effects of that. But most countries seem to feel they have, in Europe at least, they have pretty strong contractual arrangements which won't be broken, not in the public sector. I mean, obviously, the price rises in the private sector. So obviously, I can't comment on those specifics, but one of the things about all of these innovative pricing schemes is there has to be a firm contractual basis for setting it up. And that includes who's going to collect what data, if any data is necessary, and what the pricing arrangements would be. Obviously, I don't have many examples of the pricing arrangements because they're kept confidential. You probably need to ask, one of your contacts in the ministry somewhere.
Okay. Another question from the last section, and Marisa was Andres is also online, so if he would like to share some of his thoughts as well. But the question is about having a particular cost effectiveness threshold for ultra rare disease. Would would this be a good strategy, or not having any cost effectiveness threshold would be a better decision? To have or not to have a cost effectiveness threshold for
Okay.
this?
Well, I remember a time I was in Brazil. I think my last time in Brazil was in the middle of a big discussion on this. I think the first thing to say is that if you're making a decision, you have a threshold, right? It's whether you make it explicit or not. So I think the question is more, should there be an explicit threshold? And perhaps a subsidiary question is, should that threshold be the same across the board, or should there be differences in different cases? So I think having an explicit threshold is useful, even if you're going to depart from it. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the UK, or let's say England with NICE, appears to have a hard threshold but doesn't necessarily keep to it. But I think that's better than having no indication of what you feel is good value for money, because ideally you should seek to know what your opportunity cost to health is for your country. You know, those figures that Mark presented earlier. So, you would want to know if you were going to accept a new technology at a much higher price than would be justified by your threshold, what the consequences of that would be. That's not to say you shouldn't do it, but you need to understand the consequences in foregone health of going above your threshold. So it seems to me, as in all forms of life, it's good to have some kind of measure of a standard to guide your behavior, even if you can find legitimate ways of departing from that standard. So my first point would be, I'd always want to see an explicit threshold, and the closer that was to your opportunity cost of health, the better. Now, the second thing is, well, we may have different thresholds in different circumstances. Well, I think that, again, that's possible as long as you have a good reason for doing it. And I suppose the reason that most countries have had different thresholds has been because of severity of condition. I think rarity is a much more difficult area to argue, because most of the public surveys have said, people don't understand why you should pay. Now, one just from these to those of us who are just in the general gene pool, and we should recognise that in some way. And that would be okay as long as you're explicit about that, So I think having thresholds is important so that you understand the consequences of departing from them. That doesn't mean you have to be exactly keeping to your threshold all the time.
I want to do a question for Paul and for Mike about the idea of having a special budget for ultra-rare disease. What's the experience with cancer drug funds? Do you think it's a good idea or not?
I think that's quite difficult to answer in a simple way. I think having a budget is always important, because then you understand the consequences of going off your budget, right? If you were going to have a separate budget for rare diseases, you'd have to figure out what's the basis for the size of that budget. I mean, we have an overall healthcare budget in most countries that's determined through the political process. To carve up bits of that budget internally for different things, I think there'd have to be some reasoning about why that should be. I think that one advantage of having a budget for rare diseases would be that the trade-offs within rare disease would become apparent. That if you were keeping to that budget, everybody would understand that spending a lot of money in one direction would mean that something else had to be foregone. But I think I would generalize your question more to how do we get a system where opportunity costs are flagged up more often? That's the important thing, that everybody know. So if you wanted to spend, $1 million on a treatment for one baby with spinal muscular atrophy, everybody needs to understand what would be foregone because of that. What does that represent in terms of other services? So I think if you had a budget for different rare diseases, you would understand that spending more on one rare disease would mean there's less to spend on other rare diseases. But the chances are that the budget would be challenged. Like when we tried something in England to have a special fund for cancer, right? And then first thing is that it grew such a large amount that, we decided we couldn't just keep going on like that. So had to constrain it. So I think I wouldn't say don't. It should be definitely on your list of things to consider. But when I think you have Andreas talking this afternoon about budget thresholds, and it's a complicated business because there are budget thresholds can be established for different kinds of purposes. One is for a hard budget, but there's other ways in which people establish these thresholds for different reasons.
Thanks, Marisa. So as health economists, we have to work with budgets which are made available to us. Sometimes we are very used to think about the allocation of an overall healthcare budget, and that budget reflects societal choices to spend on health. It's complex to have a designated budget for rare diseases for the reasons that Mike has outlined. And I think Mike gave a strong emphasis that the real priority is to understand opportunity costs of spending. But as a personal view, I think it's something that should be considered carefully and possibly favourably, particularly if we can better understand the consequences for the wider healthcare system of the size of that rare disease budget. If it can be done with consideration of those resources consequentially being unavailable for other areas of health, but it reflects societal political choices in Brazil, I think that is reasonable. And it really is a means of both highlighting the need to make choices within rare disease spend, but also between rare disease spend and other conditions. So not easy, but it might be a reasonable idea in my personal opinion.
Andres?
Thank you, Marisa, and thank you, Mike, for your presentation. One question specifically on budget impact thresholds, Mike. Many countries use modifiers or different cost effectiveness thresholds, in some for rare disease or for severe disease or cancer. Are you aware of any country or healthcare system that use a different budget impact threshold for rare disease? For in the case of UK, the budget impact test of 20 million is different for ultra rare disease or rare disease and for other conditions? Or do you know about other countries that use a modifier for the budget impact in these cases?
I think in England it's the same. I think that budget, that 20 million, is the same for everything. I mean, the good thing about rare diseases is that there are not many patients, so you don't. You could be very inefficient if in the sense of not producing much health, but you don't hit some of those thresholds because the budget thresholds because there's not many patients. So, like in for spinal muscular atrophy, I think we would expect, about 30 to 40 babies a year. And, if it's £1 million, okay, it's getting above that threshold, but £1 million per baby, say. But a lot of the rare diseases, even ultra rare, are not going to hit that sort of threshold. I'm not sure why you would have a different. Well, I mean, better for you to talk and you expand your talk, but the reasons people have budgetary thresholds are quite various, aren't they? And the budgetary threshold has to be judged in the context of what its purpose was for. And it's not just about having a firm budget for a particular condition. But as you say, I think it's difficult. Having these budgetary carve-outs for different things are quite a problem.
Great. We time for some questions. So, Mike, one of the questions from the audience is related about the evidence. You were talking about the challenges about running a randomized control trial in the same standard of other disease. So we are facing a lot of single-arm trials and with, of course, small sample sizes. So the question is about the acceptance of about new tools to analyze this. Like the question is talking about particular the use of AI for running and trying to create twins about those patients and having a comparative arm or any other tools are being to.
I mean, some of the more recent examples, if you take the drug for retinal disease and the drug for SMA, where they didn't have controlled trials, they had historical cohorts, and I suppose by the time one of those drugs gets to Brazil, there would have been a few evaluations in different countries, and I suppose the question for Brazil would be whether the historical cohort that was used as the comparator in the previous evaluations was a historical cohort that would be relevant to Brazil. It certainly probably wouldn't be relevant in terms of cost. It might be relevant in terms of the outcomes on the grounds that for some of these rare diseases, current treatment varies a lot across countries, but it's a mixture of things, and generally they're not efficacious. So you could probably assume that whatever people were currently doing, it wasn't very effective. So it's not a problem taking that data for Brazil, as just assuming no effectiveness of current therapy. But the costs probably wouldn't be transferable, obviously. But I think you're going to find that there's a lot of progress going to be made on what to do with these, getting a comparator in a single arm trial, because it's something that's being confronted every day now, and I'm sure there'll be some good solutions coming forward.
And one more question, talking about other domains, other decision domains, and related with ultra rare disease. Should we value more the change of natural history, like having very innovative therapy that changes the natural history of a ultra rare disease? Is the first option to treat that condition? Should we value more this kind of domain, or we should take the same domains of other diseases to define this cost?
Yeah, people often talk about step changes and transformative therapies and this kind of thing. Obviously, if it's step change, it would generate more qualies, right? So that would justify a higher price because you've generated more qualies. In the English HST program, as Mark pointed out, that if you generate more qualies, it does increase the threshold as well, which is essentially saying that giving people 30 qualies is almost giving them a life when they wouldn't have had one before. And therefore, that in that program, that justifies a higher threshold. But it's still, to some extent, the threshold is reflecting you're giving more qualies. So I don't think, in principle, it should make too much difference. There may be cases where you take someone's health to a much better level that really makes their lived life totally different from what it was before. But I think that's generally picked up in the qualities gained.
Right. Yeah. Another question about all those criteria being applied in different ways in different agencies. Have you seen some impact of this heterogeneity of criteria and decisions during the evidence you have seen?
Well, what we do see is this heterogeneity in the decisions, whether it's the precise causes. My sense is it's not so much with the different methods. I think it's more to do with, the wealth of the country and, other external factors. I mean, there've been very few studies like this, but, we did one study comparing decisions for cancer drugs if you use qualies versus you're using the French, level of innovation system, and they're pretty much the same. You've got the same answer pretty much across those two quite different evaluation systems. So I think I wouldn't worry too much about all the variations around the world. I think you should focus on what's the method you think is most appropriate for Brazil, and be aware of what's gone on, but then just decide what you think is the most appropriate decision in your country, the most appropriate approach.
At the end, it's all about transparency and having the same criteria. Another point, we were talking before about the severity criteria and the rarity criteria. Mark was talking about the situation, the criteria NICE uses. Do you think we should also use this both criteria when we are talking about ultra rare disease, the ultra rare situation, but the severity as well as some kind of guidance about how should we value the efficiency of those technologies?
Yeah, I don't. I think that's very difficult. I'm sure the manufacturers would like to use every criteria possible, but I think NICE has tried to keep these things in different buckets. It's as you have the severity criteria that affects everything, and then rarity only for certain ultra rare conditions. So I think it's trying to keep them separate. The other thing that's coming along is looking at equity in various ways through distributional cost effectiveness analysis, and be interested to see how that plays out. Could it be, is something inequitable, and for a severe condition, should they get double weighting? I think NICE is going to want to keep one argument separate from another somehow.
I have one more question, not only to Mike, but to Alfredo, to Paul, and to Luciene that are with us. One special problem in Brazil is accountability. Yes, about a lot of lawsuits and legal problems, especially for high-cost drugs. The lawyers and the instance in Brazil always question if you put the drug, if you adopt the drug, but if you do not adopt the drug. And in your opinion, what is the problem? What we may not do? What can create problems for the decision-making in strategy, especially for Conitec, in your opinion and in your experience, beginning with Mike and Mark?
I think there isn't an easy way. Like, whatever you do, it's going to be a problem, right? So I think the way forward is to have some clear criteria for your decision making and then stick to it as best you can. You know, and the fundamental one for economists is, you know, recognizing opportunity cost, and you know, and then there may be some things you want to consider on top of that to do with fairness or equity or whatever. But you still need some general rules, because otherwise, if you try and take every decision independently, it just gets too much. You know, you get pushed around one way or another. And I think, you know, it's like parenting. If it's a firm no, people understand it. You know, if you're fuzzy in your decision making, then that's gonna give you problems.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I look a little disembodied here. I think that's right. I think transparency is fundamental here. Let's be clear, this is political. And I think sometimes HTA organizations have tried to play the political game by reducing transparency and just trying to keep people happy. I think the key to this is to be able to demonstrate the implications of decisions. So a no decision on a particular product can be justified on the basis of what it means for other patients. NICE really has never played that game apart from in the general. They talk all the time about opportunity costs to defend their decisions, but they they never make recourse to actually the evidence on opportunity costs by saying, if we funded this product, this is the magnitude of health that other types of patients would lose, given the budget impact and given our need to fund other things. So I think it's about absolute transparency, not partial transparency. Now, I think it was Paul earlier was right about political decisions. I mean, if there is a wish to give, say, rare disease additional support, and there can be all kinds of reasons for that, by weighting benefits from treatments for those diseases more highly, absolutely fine. But again, the implications of that for other patients and the evidence on that should be produced, so that those decisions are held accountable. The part of the challenge is particularly for rare disease, it's very easy to identify patients who will go without those new treatments if the decision is no, but it's always very difficult to find individual patients who are negatively affected by the opportunity costs, by their services not receiving funding because all or some of that funding has gone on the new drug for rare disease. So, you know, I think that would be my advice, to make this transparent and if decisions to give additional weight to treatments for rare disease are taken for a range of reasons, the reasons for that and the implications of it should also be transparent.
Morning, everyone. I think it's for the my perspective, the governance of the who makes the decision. First thing, I think that the individual decision, it's very different from the collective, the big decision for our mission in Ministry of Health that determines some decision for the whole people, for the society, for the Brazilian society. And when we discuss these or debate these with the judge or the public who claim for a rare orphan drug for a rare disease, people thinks that the people want that the Ministry of Health makes an individual decision, or I need this drug and I have the rights of this drug, of this treatment, and they could be a big debate of individual and collective decision. But I think that we have our other stories or the price, or who came first came the price, you know, for this that pressure the markets for ultra rare disease or rare disease, and we don't have a limit or we don't have a cap of this price. And I don't know if it's ethical, or also if could be ethical or also justo, como que é? Fair. Sorry. It's not ethical and not fair. That's a kind of ultra rare disease costs $1 million, and a rare disease costs $10 million. Why some patients cost more than others? We know that the laboratories have the cost of the production, the development, the research and development, but we have also a cost of our lives, or we have some budgets that we need to distribute and treat the people, and we don't have this. It's not ethical. Some disease costs more than others when we're talking about ultra rare or rare disease, or unfair conditions for people, for children. And I think we need to discuss more about this value of these conditions, value of the severity, value of the rare or ultra rare disease. And in this discussion, with the judge, also with the society, also with the patients. It's not fair. One condition costs much more than other conditions.
Yeah.
Thanks. After you, Mark.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the way that health technology assessment in general has moved, but particularly economic evaluation, is that it's not about the condition, it's not about the disease, it's about what the interventions offer in terms of health improvement. And for the general principle that we use as practitioners of economic evaluation is that a quality adjusted life year is that's the starting point, of equal value to all patients. But there are a range of reasons within a healthcare system, within a political environment why certain types of health gain are considered to be of higher value than others. But that's entirely normative, subjective. There is no scientific truth about that. But that's what public debates should be about. In my country, there has been no public debate. These things are determined by NICE and by the government as a way often to avoid quite difficult political problems. The ideal should be, and I don't know whether this is feasible in Brazil, is to try and have a public debate about these types of issues, but again, being very clear about the implications for other types of patients if certain diseases or health improvement in certain diseases is given additional weight. In the UK, whenever something's given extra weight, like through severity or rarity, or indeed more recently in the context of health inequalities, there's rarely any discussion and certainly no evidence about how it impacts on other types of patients. If something is upweighted, then something else has to be downweighted. But that's never transparent. It's never open in the discussion. So I would encourage that sort of debate to happen in Brazil if it's possible, and that to be part of a sort of transparent process of trying to think about how to inform these different decisions.
I was going to say something similar to Mark there, actually, to answer your question, Marisa, how to deal with the issue of litigation and the court cases. I have to say, I've been struck meeting Brazilians around the world that there's real pride in SUS, that there's a collective healthcare system here for everyone's benefit. And we've had that in the past in the UK. It's been under pressure. But people recognise that the healthcare system is there to meet everyone's needs. But there are challenges in doing that, and there are constraints. So as well as transparency, as Mark highlighted, has been important, I think that needs to go hand in hand with ongoing public education, recognising these trade-offs and the consequences of the trade-offs as they are made. I'd just like to make one more point. We've highlighted within this morning's discussions a lot the opportunity costs associated with spending on rare diseases. And yes, a starting point can be that a quality is equaled the same for whoever receives that quality. But I think we should also all be aware that individuals and families who suffer from rare diseases feel at times that their conditions, their needs are not being met due to that rarity, as if they were suffering from condition with and that feels unfair. There's a normative basis for dealing with such rare conditions differently because the size of the patient populations is small and there's less of a market there for product development. So there is a bit, but the important thing is recognizing the trade-offs and the societal decisions that need to be made in respect of opportunity costs, and doing that through ongoing public education, even though that's often a very hard thing, I think feels to me to be a necessary endeavour in Brazil.
Yes, I would like to share some thoughts regarding this issue related to HTA and justice, and of course with my perspective. In many Latin American countries, for instance, in Brazil and in Argentina and so many other countries, the right to health is an individual right instead of more like a collective right, like for instance in the UK, and of course that is having implication in how the justice can work and make decisions about the coverage of healthcare technologies. And at the same time, I would like to say that, of course, I think that in some occasions, for instance, in the context of Argentina, the justice makes good decisions because some particular cases that are right to the justice are more related to people who is not able to access to the basic health benefit package. So, I mean, not always the justice is doing something that could be or can create some conflict with HTA methods. But of course, I think that is very clear in our countries that there are some like empty spaces in communication between justice and between the HTA bodies, and maybe a starting point to try to fill those gaps is, as many of my colleagues mentioned before, is try to be transparent. I mean, HTA agency needs to be transparent about methods, about health opportunity cost, about the consequences of not adhere to a rational decision for the healthcare system in order to start having a more complete and more transparent process conversation with the justice in order to complete this these gaps in communications. So yeah, that I think that could be a good starting point. Recognize that in some cases justice could be useful, and of course try to think how we can start increasing our transparency to improve our communication with the justice.
Okay, I think we have one last question after we have a break or another. Okay, sorry. And this question is for Paul. I think it's related with what we were discussing now. It's about the society opinion or society preferences, because we talk a lot about patient preferences as well, but how could we get the society opinion about the decisions on ultra-rare disease? In Brazil, we have a public consultation about all the decisions. Would this would this fit as a tool as well, or do you think we have some other options about having society opinion on those decisions?
Yeah, I think you could take two approaches: a more qualitative approach, as it sounds like you are doing, having consultation and hearing views, but there are also possibilities of eliciting society views on these trade-offs as well, whether society would be willing to pay more to meet needs of those with rare conditions, even if that meant that more qualities were foregone in other areas of health. So you could develop an elicitation exercise to look at that, but even doing so qualitatively through societal consultation seems appropriate. I think it was Mike made some reference to efforts to incorporate equity more formally in HTA. There are a number of avenues that there can be done. Sometimes the framing for equity can be around affecting distributions of health. So it's giving greater priority of those with anticipated lower lifetime health. Sometimes it can be in respect of considering out-of-pocket costs or financial protection of individuals and families with members who are suffering from rare diseases. I think it's reasonable to think that they will face wider challenges in respect of needing to pay for healthcare, maybe time outside of work. Also, those aspects can be considered as others. So whether you do that in a more qualitative way or in a quantitative way, I think it's extremely valuable and would help, especially from hand in hand with this public education in making these trade-offs and informing CONITEC and Ministry of Health how those trade-offs are made. I think it would just enhance the process.
Então, queria agradecer todas as contribuições, as pessoas que mandaram perguntas para poder enriquecer o nosso debate. Agora, para dar seguimento à nossa oficina,